Welcome to Podkey Slopcast, where tonight's AI policy shock needs more scrutiny than slogans. A Friday evening order reportedly forced Anthropic to shut off its top models for every foreign national, no matter where they were. If that's accurate, this wasn't just a company problem, it was a live test of how abruptly governments think they can govern frontier AI. The core reported fact is stark. The US Commerce Department issued an export control directive that forced Anthropic to suspend access to Fable 5 and Mythos 5 for any foreign national, regardless of location. Anthropic reportedly got the order at 5:21 p.m. on a Friday and had to disable the models immediately to stay compliant. That's why people are calling it an unprecedented Friday night AI shutdown. Before getting into the politics, it's worth pausing on the mechanism. Export controls used to bring to mind chips, materials, and machinery. Here, the thing being restricted is model access, and the trigger is urgent enough that a private company apparently flipped the switch in real time. That matters because it tells us the government's practical theory of control. If advanced models are strategic technologies, then access itself becomes the regulated good, even when the user isn't crossing a border in the usual sense. The reported trigger was a jailbreak allegation, but the details matter a lot. This was described as a narrow, non-universal exploit that let the model read a codebase and suggest fixes. That sounds serious until you ask two follow-up questions. First, was this a broadly reusable bypass that defeats the safety architecture in general? Second, did it unlock clearly harmful capabilities that weren't already available elsewhere? Based on the claims here, the answer to the first question appears to be no. Anthropic says no universal jailbreak has been demonstrated. And on the second question, critics of the government's move argue the capability itself is already public in other models, including OpenAI's GPT 5.5, and is routine for legitimate defensive work. Reading code and suggesting fixes isn't some exotic wartime power on its face. That doesn't make the exploit irrelevant. A narrow jailbreak is still evidence that safeguards can fail. But if the public justification rests on that vulnerability alone, the leap from narrow exploit to blanket nationality-based shutdown needs much stronger support than we've seen in these reports. Anthropic's response is basically a defense-in-depth argument. Perfect jailbreak resistance is impossible, so the real goal is to make attacks narrow, expensive, detectable, and quickly fixable. The company says it layered safeguards, added aggressive monitoring, and keeps data retention to 30 days so it can investigate and mitigate fast. That's a fairly standard security posture in complex systems. Nobody serious believes a frontier model can be made permanently exploit-proof. The more realistic question is whether the residual risk is being managed at a level proportionate to the model's capabilities. Anthropic's stronger claim is that the reported exploit didn't produce harmful outcomes and wasn't universal, so the response was disproportionate to the demonstrated risk. That claim sounds better supported than the idea that one narrow jailbreak by itself justifies a sweeping access ban. Still, there is missing context. We don't know whether the government is acting on additional classified evidence or whether officials are trying to set a deterrent precedent before more serious failures happen. This is where the debate gets messy. Tech commentators like Bindu Reddy and Katie Mazouris called the move an overreaction, arguing the same information is already widely online and is commonly used by defenders. Former officials like Chris Maguire criticized selective enforcement as incoherent, especially if chip controls exist, but aren't being applied consistently while a model gets blocked without transparent justification. Those criticisms hit a real weakness. Selective enforcement erodes legitimacy fast, especially in a field where companies need predictable rules to make deployment decisions. At the same time, governments do sometimes move inconsistently during the early phase of regulating a new strategic technology. Incoherence can reflect overreach, but it can also reflect a state apparatus trying to improvise before it has a settled framework. The problem is that improvisation by government lands as hard law for everyone else. Firms bear the cost immediately, whether or not the policy logic is fully worked out. The broader warning from industry is that if this standard spread across frontier model providers, deployment of new powerful systems could slow dramatically, or labs might preemptively blunt releases to avoid regulatory tripwires. That concern isn't just self-interested lobbying. If companies learn that a narrow reported exploit can trigger abrupt nationality-based restrictions, the rational response is to reduce exposure, cut openness, and centralize access behind heavier controls. That could chill research collaboration, push talent toward jurisdictions with looser rules, and deepen the balkanization of AI resources. In other words, the US might gain short-term control while weakening its long-term position in the ecosystem. Historical comparisons to the 1990s crypto export fights are useful here. Those battles eventually looked like policy trying to bottle up a capability that was too diffused and too commercially important to contain cleanly. The comparison isn't exact, and advanced AI may raise different stakes, but the warning is the same. Rules built for strategic control can backfire if they mostly punish compliant domestic actors while the underlying capability keeps spreading. The market angle is more than headline drama. Analysts warned Anthropic's IPO valuation could take as much as a 25% hit because access to its most advanced model is now politically contingent, which directly weakens revenue assumptions. Investors are also learning a harsher lesson about model risk. It's not only technical risk or competition risk anymore, it's sovereign intervention risk. Once capital starts pricing in the possibility that governments can suddenly pull access to frontier systems, money gets more cautious. That doesn't mean funding disappears, but it can become more selective, more concentrated, and less patient. And that changes product strategy. Companies may favor enterprise deals, cleared customers, and domestically legible compliance models over broad global access. Innovation doesn't necessarily stop, but it may narrow. One of the biggest implications is operational. Observers expect a regime where advanced AI gets treated more like nuclear, space, or other strategic technologies, with government clearance and KYC-style checks for who gets to use what. If these export controls stick, Anthropic may need identity verification at the API layer to distinguish US citizens or cleared entities from everyone else. That's a huge shift from the current assumption that model access is mostly an account and billing problem. And the effect wouldn't stop at one lab. Cloud providers, downstream AI products, legal firms, and every other integrator would inherit the compliance burden. That creates a trade-off policymakers should be explicit about. Stronger control may reduce some national security risk, but it also builds surveillance, friction, and gatekeeping directly into the application layer of AI. The open question is whether that architecture ends up targeting genuinely dangerous access patterns, or whether it mostly turns general-purpose tools into permissioned infrastructure for a shrinking set of approved users. What seems best supported right now is the narrow point. The public case for this response looks thinner than the severity of the action. What remains uncertain is the bigger point, whether officials are overreacting to a minor exploit or signaling a durable doctrine that frontier AI access will be governed like a strategic resource. If it's the second, this episode may matter less as a one-night shutdown than as the moment everyone realized the AI market has a new choke point, and it's political. That's it for Podkey Slopcast. The facts here are still moving, but the policy logic is already worth watching very closely. This episode was generated by Podkey. Create your own at podkey.fm.